Alright guys, another day, another strength. Got another mind over muscles video for you today. This time we're talking about the bench press, right? Everybody's favorite lift. The big booby press as they call it, right? So yeah, the bench. Let's talk about why. Why are we benching in the first place? Well, the bench press is the most popular upper body lift in the world, right? Especially among the hombres, the men. It is also the heaviest upper body lift that you can perform, so it's a great overload upper body lift. And bench press is a very unique lift in the sense that it's the only lift of the big three or big four, depending how you look at those, that does not require the lifter to balance on their own 2 feet, meaning that the bench is involved and you're lying down flat, right? The overhead press, the squat, the deadlift, you're on your 2 feet. You know, you have a fixed kinetic chain there from your feet to your hands. Bench press, the kinetic chain runs from your shoulder blade to your hands, so it's basically just your arms. And the rest of your body is involved, which I'll get into in a moment. But that is basically the long and short of that. The prime movers in the bench press, right? We got the pecs, the front delts, the triceps, and also the biceps. A lot of people don't know this, but the biceps cross 2 joints, right? So the elbow and the shoulder joint, right? 2 joints like Sublime. The biceps, essentially in that fashion, during the bench press, they function as a smaller pair of pecs because they basically have the same functions as the pecs as far as adducting the humerus, bringing it back to the midline, right? As far as the postural muscles involved in the bench press, we have mainly the upper back, so that's basically your stable platform that is maintaining the arch that's very crucial in the bench press. We'll talk about that in a moment. But we got the traps, the lats, the spinal erectors. We also have, as far as the legs go, we're going to use the legs in the bench press if we're benching properly. So we're using the quads, the glutes, and then we're also using, as postural muscles, the forearms and the neck, right? So my assistant here is blocking those 2, but those are in there as well. The forearms are very, very important, right? That is your last point of transfer from your elbow to your hands. And that's why people tend to wear wrist wraps. They can keep the wrist even more tight. The forearm muscles are going to handle the bulk of that. And then the wrist wraps basically work like a belt would for keeping your wrist nice and steady. As far as the technique goes in the bench press, the bench is generally the most technically simple of the main 4 lifts. It's very important that you get a big arch in the bench, right? So you're basically trying to puff your chest out, extend your thoracic spine, and that is going to fix a couple of issues that we have with the bench press. Number 1 is that the bar path cannot be vertical in the bench press, right? It can't be straight down and straight up because you run into one of 2 issues. You either have the main issue with that is that you're going to have a shoulder injury situation, right? So if you're bringing your arms out like this, you're going to wind up impinging your shoulder down here at the bottom of the range of motion. That's why you see, like back in the day, there were a lot of big bodybuilders and they would kind of bench like halfway down, but with their arms way out here like this. Like Jay Cutler is a big proponent of that if you watch him bench. So the reason that you don't go all the way down is, you know, the bro science behind it was like, you know, like I just don't have to do it or it doesn't feel good or whatever. But really what's happening is you're impinging structures in your shoulder, meaning you're tearing up your soft tissues, which is not good, right? So that's why you can't have vertical bar path. So now in an ideal world, that vertical bar path would give you good mechanical efficiency, right? Because you're keeping the bar over the center of balance, which is the shoulder in the bench press. Every other lift, it's the midfoot. So you're not, you know, your feet aren't really part of the kinetic chain in the bench press. So the shoulder joint is essentially the midfoot. So you're actually going to have a diagonal bar path. Still going to be a straight diagonal line, right? But what that is going to do is it's going to not tear up your shoulder, right? But it introduces a small mechanical inefficiency. So in order to mitigate that, if you arch your chest way up and do this, right, then the bar is not going to have to come down quite as far. So if I'm just laying flat backed, right, and you have this diagonal line, then the bar has to come like all the way down to here, and then it gets further from the shoulder at the bottom. Whereas if the person arches their chest way up, then that point is actually closer to the shoulder, and the overall range of motion is shorter, and you can lift more weight that way. So yeah, that's how you get a bench for strength. Basically, it creates better leverage for the muscles and allows more weight to be lifted. Common errors in the same vein, right? We have the bar path. That's a big one. So people oftentimes will either go like straight down or not far enough out or too far out, right? And so they put a big moment arm on the shoulder. And so, you know, speaking of the shoulder, like shoulder injuries are very common with the bench press, and it's pretty much always related to some kind of bar path issue. So bringing the bar down to the shoulder, bringing the bar too far down away from the shoulder, so on and so forth. So if you sort that out, then you're good. Generally, in the bench press, everything stays still except for the elbows. Like just the elbow joint moves through space. Obviously your shoulder joint is rotating, but it's not like moving around during the lift through space. Just your elbows are moving through space. Everything else is just staying still. So number 2 common errors here, we have cheating, right, in various degrees. So if you're not competing in a powerlifting meet or whatever, you can basically do whatever you want, but there are certain methods that will make the bench easier and kind of take the stress off of the prime movers, right? So you're not really training the bench press effectively if you're doing it like this, where you kind of run into trouble and you run into sticking points and plateaus. But some of these are, you're cutting off the range of motion / the depth. So they just put in like a new powerlifting rule where your elbows have to kind of hit depth with your shoulders. So it's a good idea to do that so you're getting a long enough range of motion to actually train the muscles involved in the bench press effectively. Another method of cheating is lifting the butt up off the bench. So you're basically turning it into a decline bench. And that's kind of like squatting high, where like, you can start lifting it a little bit, and then as the weight gets heavier, you can lift your butt way off the bench and it becomes like a ridiculous kind of circus act. And then the last one is kind of, it depends on who you're asking. In some powerlifting meets, they kind of like employ this as part of the technique, but if it's, sinking / heaving, which is when you sink the bar into your chest and you kind of like relax your arch, and then you explosively leg drive and then like fling the bar up in the air. So that is a common technique error, right? So as far as the actual leg drive, the way that you're supposed to do it, right? Because you are supposed to leg drive in the bench press, you just want a consistent tension through your quads that is going to keep you pinned against the bench, right? So you don't want to leg drive so hard that you're like sliding off the bench and pushing straight horizontally. That's not how you want to leg drive. It's almost like a diagonal down into the bench, just enough to keep you still and keep you sturdy, right? So you can lift more weight if you incorporate the legs and do the sink and the heave, but just be aware that you're going to be leaving yourself open to getting flack on the internet. So if you want to bench that way, that's totally fine. But as far as like the greater good of the internet form police, right? If you incorporate more slop in your bench, you're leaving yourself open to have an asterisk placed next to your large lift, right? And then the last common technique error is general looseness. The biggest things I see are like having no leg drive, or just like being loose and floppy, having no arch, or like starting with an arch and then it collapses at the bottom and then it kind of like comes back on the way up. And then also like just dropping the bar / bouncing the bar off the chest, where you have like no tension and no control during the eccentric. You just like drop it on yourself and try to fling it back up. And oftentimes those wind up in failed bench presses, or like injuries and nagging stuff, right? So yeah, that's basically the technique. As far as variations that work great for the bench press, we have number 1, my favorite, the close grip bench press. So that is basically any type of bench press you can turn into a close grip bench press if you're using a barbell. With a regular bench, it can be a floor press, it can be the dead bench off the pins, it can be any kind of incline or decline bench. Speaking of those, number 2 is different angles of pressing, right? So we have incline and decline bench, and then I also include vertical overhead pressing in this as well. That is going to help your bench press. So basically, the more specific you want it to be, the closer to a bench press it should be. So like a 15 or 30 degree incline, and then the higher the incline, the more it's going to resemble an overhead press, which is still going to carry over to your bench. But I would cover, if you're just trying to bench as much as you can, cover the more similar to flat variations first. And then also decline benching, I'm not a big fan of because it gets kind of dangerous with the barbell. But you can incorporate some of that as like an overload variation. But you're probably better off using an overload variation like a slingshot or a pin bench or something like that. But yeah, I didn't include overload variations on the list of variations, but you can't use them. They do work for some people. I just find that generally the hardest part of the range of motion is usually somewhere between like the chest and halfway up. It's usually not further up than that. So if you are going to use an overload variation, set it pretty close to the chest, or it's really, if you do like a pin bench that's, close to the lockout, that's an overload. But if you do a pin bench close to your chest, it's actually an underload. It's going to be less weight than your normal bench. So I wouldn't even consider that an overload. So that's why I didn't list those in this list. But they will work for some people. And then lastly, a lot of different bodybuilding work, right? So you can basically watch any like Josh Bryant or Julius Maddox video and figure out what is going to work well for a bench press. Julius Maddox is the strongest bencher in the world. Josh Bryant is a very well-renowned bench press coach who coaches Julius Maddox. But yeah, basically it's a lot of like lats, traps, all the delts, so rear delts and front delts, not so much side delts actually, more rear and front delts, triceps, the pecs, and biceps. So basically work for all those muscles. You'll see like the dudes I mentioned before, they do a lot of like seal rows, they do a lot of dumbbell work, they do a lot of like tricep work. So that's your bread and butter for bench press. Very similar to the deadlift. The bench is probably the least specific main movement as far as the technique, right? It's not that technical. The downside is that the bench uses smaller muscles, if we're comparing it to the deadlift at least, right? So the bench press is using smaller muscles, so it is more sensitive to variations in the technique, but the technique itself is not very difficult. So you can get away with not benching for a while and then still have a strong bench press. But just know that if there are any variations in the technique, they'll have a bigger impact on the lift. But it's just, harder to have those variations there. But generally, bigger muscles equals bigger bench. So like the more jacked you can get, the better your bench is going to be. It's I think Dan Green has a quote that bench press is 90% bodybuilding, and that's pretty true. But yeah, as far as programming progression, 1 to 5 reps for skill/practice. Your heavy bench work, your pin variations I was talking about, your pause variations, stuff like that. 5 to 10 reps for the supplemental barbell lifts. So like your overhead pressing, your incline bench pressing, even like flat bench pressing can work in that range, right? A lot works for the bench press, as I said before. And then 10 plus for a lot of the supplemental work. So like the, if you're doing like rear delt work or like triceps work, sometimes like dumbbell bench press, although that tends to work better in the 5 to 10 rep range. And then some of the shoulder stuff too, if you're doing like upright rows or you're doing like face pulls or something to train, even like behind the neck press, train different heads of the shoulder. Some of that can be done in the 5 to 10 range, but a lot of the times it can be 10 plus. And then you do your sets as you need. You can prioritize adding weight for strength work and prioritize accumulating sets and reps for volume work. And you can generally get away with a lot of sets for bench press, especially with the lighter variations, because it's just not using as many muscles. It's not as systemically taxing because you're not using, much of the rest of your kinetic chain. So you're basically just leg driving, and that's kind of using, your spinal erectors and your abs, but not really, not to a large degree. So you can get away with a lot of bench pressing. Basically, you can just bro out, have like a 2-hour workout, have a ton of volume in there, and it's going to help your bench press out. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. In the next one, I'll probably touch briefly on the chin up and the row as main movements, and then we'll get into some more of the specifics of the more bodybuilding stuff after that. So yeah, if you guys want to see anything specific, say so in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video. All right, goodbye.